Shall I just start then just by talking about the aims, because this bit will be recorded anyway, so we do have an awful lot to get through. So are you able to move the slide, Iona, or can I move it? Okie dokie, everyone. So as we said, welcome to this evening. The aims of this evening's course, we have 4 in total, which are going to be running across the session. But the aims of this evening's course are going to be to look at the researchers, historical and current, in the thinking around about dyscalculia. Hopefully raising awareness and explaining the new Scottish Working Definition, which was launched in April this year. We're going to discuss the characteristics of dyscalculia and the impact that this can have on lifelong learning, highlight some assessment and identification processes, and illustrate teaching strategies and approaches. So the assessment and identification and the teaching strategies will be in the next sessions to come. Tonight we're really going to be focusing in on the history and the research, the working definition, and discussing some of the characteristics as such. So got the next slide. So this really, again, is the overview of the professional learning sessions, which you can see here, which you'll have on the flyer, which I'm sure you've already saw. And we have the different dates which are across the session. And down the bottom of this, you'll also see that there is a team code, as we'd mentioned earlier on, that we have set up a team where we'll be able to put all of the videos and the PowerPoint slides and the recording of the slide and any resources as across the session that we feel is appropriate. And also it's a hub for yourself to ask any questions and to get some professional discussion with other colleagues across the I'm saying authority, but across the country as well. So it's going to be a really good working space, hopefully, that we're able to all make great use of. So if we move on then, we're going to just start this evening, as I said, about understanding and thinking about dyscalculia. So to start us off, this was a great quote when I was working on the East Ayrshire definition, back 4 or 5 years ago. This really was the starting point for us. So as we can all know, mathematics is important in our everyday lives as it allows us to make sense of the world around us and to manage our lives. So using mathematics enables us to model real life situations and make connections and inform predictions. And it also equips us with the skills that we need to interpret and analyse information, simplify and solve problems, assess risk and make informed decisions. So learning mathematics gives children and young people, as we all know, access to the wider curriculum and also the opportunity to pursue further studies and interests. And as I said, this quote here really kind of brought it all together for me. To face the challenges of the 21st century, each young person needs to have the confidence in using mathematical skills, and Scotland needs both specialist mathematicians and a highly numerate population. And this is back at the very early days of Curriculum for Excellence and building the Curriculum 1. However, as many of us know, many of our learners find numeracy and mathematics challenging, particularly making connections and links and applying concepts to different situations. We all put interventions and supports in place with this, as I did many years ago. But then I remember having one young person, and this young person was in primary 6, top group literacy, but this young person was having real difficulties with numeracy. And it got me thinking back then, way back about 6 or 7 years ago, that despite my effective interventions and effective learning and teaching, that young person was having difficulties still. And it got me thinking that they may have a specific difficulty with numeracy and mathematics. So before we begin, Iona has put a poll into the chat, and it's really to find out from yourself what your confidence levels are around about dyscalculia. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident are you in assessing, identifying and supporting our learners with dyscalculia? So 1 being not very confident at all, up to 5 being that you feel pretty confident. So Iona's going to pop this into the chat. So I'll just give you a second or two to have a little look at that.
Sorry, Louise, I'm still letting quite a few folk into,
wow.
into the meeting. can maybe just somebody check, can they scroll up in the chat? Can you see the poll? Because I did put it in at the start, but if folk have come in since then, Mrs. Robertson's got a question, maybe you got a hand up, we'll maybe get you to pop it into the chat. Could we maybe just check, can folks see the poll? And hopefully, I think folk are popping, I don't know if folk are popping it into the chat or...
I can't see the chat.
I can't see a poll. I've looked right to the very beginning of the chat.
Oh, we've got quite a lot of people. I can see the chat. A lot of people are putting in numbers, so no, that's really helpful. So we've got 1, 2, 3. That's great. Yeah, this has given us just a real good kind of flavour of where we're pitching as well, which is great. Brilliant.
You can't see the poll. You can see the numbers.
Brilliant. That's fine. It's just really to give us an indication of where we're at with that. Iona, could you move the slide on just 2 for me, please? Oh, is it gone?
There's over 400 folk on that.
Was it? Oh, so is it all for probationers across Scotland?
No.
Hi, can I just remind everybody to have their mics on mute, if that's okay, just as you're joining. Thank you.
Iona, can you possibly put the PowerPoint back up, please? Don't worry, somebody's popped in the chat there about the team. Don't worry about that. We'll have this PowerPoint available, and on the PowerPoint is the code for being able to join the team. So don't worry about that. We can access that later.
Sorry, my machine just froze, so I'm just going to have to share the PowerPoint again. So I think is everybody happily putting in their 1s to 5s and everything? Yep. Brilliant. So
absolutely.
As ever, these things on the grand scale, I'm still admitting people to the meetings.
It's wonderful though, it's great.
It's crazy. So I will just pop the PowerPoint up again. Sorry about that. I don't think my laptop's coping with the numbers of people today. So
we're on about slide 7.
Yeah, it will be. Just give me 1 sec. Sorry about this.
No worries.
I've just turned my camera off as well because I was getting bad network quality. So I don't know if that's just with the sheer volume, but we'll see if that rectifies it.
Wonderful though.
It's great. It is. Yes, absolutely.
Lovely to welcome everybody. It really is. So I hope, as I say this afternoon, we'll be able to give you an indication, so you're maybe feeling a bit happier about the indicators for dyscalculia by the end of today, and be able to take some other further reading and things away as well, which is good for you. You should all have been emailed out as well a reflective log, and that really is what the next slide is that I've got. And this is again, because as we all know from like reflective learning with our GTC for evidence for professional learning, we put together this reflective log as it really allows you to think about aspects of the course and make links with your own practice and then possibly your learners, and then you've got something tangible that you can then upload. So the kind of few things that I was asking you to think about were just the common challenges faced by your own learners who have numeracy difficulties, maybe even not so much dyscalculia as such. So that's just really one of the questions that, again, you can hopefully reflect on. But we will start off then by what is dyscalculia, which is on the next slide. So dyscalculia is one of the kind of specific learning difficulties or differences which young people can have. But what is dyscalculia? So very recently, there was a short-lived, as I said, working party with the main purpose to agree and publish a Scottish working definition for dyscalculia. And I'll give you a bit more information on that later on. However, as we were going through this, and also myself when I was putting together the East Ayrshire policy 6 years ago, there was a lot of prominent research, and hopefully this is going to let you see that dyscalculia actually isn't as new as perhaps we think it is, and that over the years the theories have all been developed. So if we go on to the next slide. So thinking back to 1919, the concept of a specific difference with number in mathematics, it dates back as far as then, with Salomon Henge, who was a Swedish neurologist, and he first stated that a difficulty may have impaired mathematical ability while being perfectly intelligent in other ways. And this really gives us the idea and suggests that to have dyscalculia, then you'd be attaining across the rest of the curriculum, but have a specific difficulty around about numeracy and mathematics. Moving on, we move on to 1974, a little bit closer to our term as such and our kind of timeline. And this was Kosk, and he defined dyscalculia as a structural disorder of mathematical abilities which has its origin in a genetic and congenital disorder in those parts of the brain that are the anatomical, physiological substrate of the maturation of the mathematical abilities, adequate to age, without simultaneous disorder of general mental functions. Quite a mouthful for me there. However, when you start to dissect that, it really is saying, again, that these difficulties are not related to cognitive ability. But he also then takes things a little bit of a step further and suggests that dyscalculia is genetic, or it could be genetic, and also related to brain development. So again, although it kind of echoes what we had previously, it's starting to move the thinking along a little bit further. And we're going to look a little bit more at Kosk later on. Then if we move on to much closer to timelines, we've got Sharma in 1997, who defined dyscalculia as an inability to conceptualise numbers and number relationships and the outcomes of numerical operations, for example, estimating the answer to numerical problems before actually calculating it. And this really goes a little step further now and provides us with some specific difficulties which a young person or adult with dyscalculia may experience or display. We then went on and started to look at some more up-to-date, and here are a list of different researchers which you made today that you may like to go back and do a little bit more research on. And within the actual team, and the Padlet, sorry, we're going to pop in some professional reading which you may find interesting. So these are some of the really more modern and up-to-date researchers. So we have Steve Chin, who was actually at a conference just last Friday in Edinburgh discussing dyscalculia. We have Gavin Price, Brian Butterworth, again, who was at the conference in Edinburgh last week. We have Daniel Ansari, Ronit Bird, and Dr. Jo van Herwegen, who was part of, she was consulted with regards to the Scottish definition when we were just close to finishing it off, and gave us some feedback within the definition. So these are some great researchers that if you wish to carry out some additional professional reading and find out a bit more, that these are the people that you would be looking towards. But let's move on now to what we think dyscalculia is. So back earlier on, we had a little poll, but what we're going to do now is we're going to have a little think about how much you already know about dyscalculia, because we had some people who were going from 1s up to about 3s. And what I would really like to now do is just get a better feel of what you know. And we've got a little quiz. And what Iona is going to do is we have the questions are going to come up on the screen, but Iona is going to pop them into the chat. And what we'd like for you to do, I'll just pop the first one up. Iona can put the first one up for us. So we have the first one here, which is all learners with dyscalculia have the same difficulties with maths. So if you think that this is true, if you could possibly toggle on the thumbs up button on the statement, or if you think it's a myth, go to the unhappy face. So if you could just click on that and see where we think we're at. And we'll just give a wee minute or two. Oh, the numbers are flying up. I'll give you just a wee minute just to have a little think about that. So an unhappy face if you think it's a myth, and a thumbs up if we think that it is true. Are we getting many responses, Maria?
Yep, they're going up. Yep, the numbers are racing up. So some people are putting in the chat pane, and others are just using the emoji on the actual statement itself. But combined, we've got quite a few responses, Louise, which is good.
Brilliant. Okay,
And most people are suggesting that indeed is a myth.
And absolutely true. It is a myth. So dyscalculia actually refers to a wide range of maths issues. So no one learner's areas of difficulty are the same as another learner's. For example, some of our learners may have difficulty with number concepts, and others have difficulty with that kind of visual-spatial thinking that's needed, for example, for geometry. However, what most learners with dyscalculia do have in common, though, are the challenges with remembering basic maths facts and completing math problems. And there are many factors that can contribute and combine to create these difficulties, each with its own level of severity. For example, with working memory. So if your learner has slow retrieval of basic facts, this could actually be due to an overload of the working memory, so there's not actually enough space left to perform calculations. So this really is to highlight that it's so important that when we're assessing for dyscalculia, that we look at all contributing factors and the impact that they can have on the ability to learn. So let's look at our next statement, that dyscalculia is another name for maths anxiety. So again, if we can toggle on to the thumbs up at the statement, or if it's a fact, sorry, and then the unhappy face on the statement if we think it is a myth. And Iona will be able to tell me what is coming in.
Oh, we've actually got a couple of we've got a bit of a split decision here. It's not quite one way, although the myth is being a bit more of a popular response for this one.
Just give another wee second or two. Okie dokie, so this one is actually a myth. So dyscalculia and maths anxiety are not the same thing. However, it is very, very understandable that people can confuse the both. When we think to a definition for maths anxiety can be a feeling of tension and anxiety that interferes with the manipulation of numbers and the solving of mathematical problems in ordinary life and academic situations. It's like a negative emotional handbrake that holds up that progress in maths, and the severity can range from feeling mild tension to experiencing a strong and deep-rooted fear of maths. However, not all learners who have dyscalculia have maths anxiety, so again we can say that they're not the same thing. So if we have a little look at the next statement, dyscalculia is basically dyslexia for maths. Thoughts on this one? I like somebody's put a comment on, but it can contribute to maths anxiety in a previous one. Absolutely. Dyscalculia can contribute to it. But again, there are separate differences or difficulties as such and can be treated as such as well. So, Maria, how are we getting on with this next statement?
Again, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I think we're leaning towards a myth more. There's a few thumbs up just coming in there. So it's a bit mixed, this one, to be honest, Louise. There's more people coming through now with thumbs up.
Okay, so
saying that this is indeed a fact. Yeah.
Dyslexia is basic. Dyscalculia is basic. Dyslexia for maths is actually a myth. Although dyscalculia is sometimes referred to as maths dyslexia, it's just a nickname. Dyslexia and dyscalculia are separate learning differences. However, there can be similarities in the factors which contribute to these difficulties and differences, and a learner can have both dyslexia and dyscalculia. And that's just like I mentioned earlier on, that when we're assessing, it is vital to look at all factors, that holistic assessment of our young person impacting on their learning in order to kind of tease out whether these can be attributed to other learning differences. So let's look at our next one. Dyscalculia is a learning difference which makes it hard to understand number concepts. Fact or myth? Well, this one seems to be going up. I can see all the thumbs that are coming in on the bottom of my screen there. They just seem to be popping up.
Yep, I think we've had a majority so far with this one.
Yep. And it is actually a fact. I think this one's quite straightforward. That is a fact that you do have difficulties around about numeracy and mathematics, yeah. So the next one is taking it a little bit further, that learners with dyscalculia don't understand the logic behind maths. Fact or myth? They don't understand the logic behind maths. I think seems to be quite of a mixed bag that's coming up on my bottom screen here.
Yep.
You the same, Maria? Yeah.
Yeah, in the chat we've had a mix of both, to be honest. So yeah, this one might need to be unpicked a little bit, Louise.
Okie dokie. So if we have a little look then, yep, it is actually a myth. Learners with dyscalculia may understand, again, we've got to think about the spectrum of difficulties, but they may understand the logic behind maths, but it's how to apply these concepts to solve other problems. It's about that kind of making the connections across different concepts and making the connections with word problems as well. So they may be able to do it in a simple fashion, but then they can't actually then take that beyond. So they can understand the logic behind the actual calculations or the operation, but then applying it is where the difficulty arises. So our next one, this is probably going to be a fairly straightforward one. Dyscalculia can co-occur with other difficulties. I don't even think we need to debate that one.
Yep, lots of thumbs up.
Yeah, it definitely is. It is a fact. Wait for the slide to pop up. So as I mentioned already, there are a few learning differences that can co-occur with dyscalculia. And as I also said, some of the indicators for other learning differences can sometimes look at it. And again, it's looking at that holistic whole child rather than just the problems which they're having. So our next one is dyscalculia isn't very common. True or myth? A few wee thoughts coming in at this one.
Lots of myths coming through in the chat, Louise.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was listening to a podcast the other night on BBC Sounds last Friday, and they were talking about it and saying that they reckon it's about 6% of the population have dyscalculia. And the reason, though, that we don't have the figures as such coming in is because it hasn't been studied as much, but that doesn't mean that it's not as common. If we think about it, when we think about numeracy difficulties, we know that there's little doubt that people know that we have a lot of young people and learners who have difficulties with numeracy. But because it lies on a spectrum, and because we haven't got as much research into it, and then obviously identifications, somebody just popped in, just no formal diagnosis or identifications, absolutely. So because we haven't got the identifications, it doesn't mean that it's not there. And then our last statement is learners with dyscalculia can't learn or have success with maths. I think this is a resounding one that's coming in as well from what I can see.
Yeah, myth is definitely the most popular response to this one.
Absolutely, yeah, it is. It's a myth. In fact, one of my colleagues, Robert McCallum, who is our education manager for numeracy, who I work very closely with in our authority, he says that everybody can get a higher maths. It might just take somebody a little bit longer, but everybody can do it. So even if a young person or a learner has dyscalculia, they may have a harder time learning maths, but it doesn't mean that they can't learn or excel at it. And we could actually parallel that by saying that a myth being that people who have dyslexia can't learn to read. Absolutely wrong, isn't it? But what we have to ensure is that our learners with dyscalculia have effective learning and teaching approaches in order to support them to develop the conceptual understanding of concepts before moving on to applying these to other situations. And we're going to discuss this a little bit further later on and in further sessions. So now that we've got our quiz out the way, we're going to have a little look at what we do actually know about dyscalculia. So we do know that, as I said already, less research has been carried out, but it's been suggested that around 4 to 6%, as I said, of the population have dyscalculia, while 10% have dyslexia. We're not 100% sure about the figures, though, as I say, because less research and also less assessment. However, we have found out that those learners whose parents have dyscalculia are 10 times more likely to have it, and 50% of learners and children who have dyscalculia also have siblings who have it as well. So if we move on now to talking about the actual Scottish working definition. So August 2021, the Scottish Government, as I said earlier, put together a working party to look at all the evidence and research that was already out there, and we were tasked with devising a Scottish
Hi,
definition.
are you able to help me? I can't get the sound on my meeting. Thank you.
Can anybody help with that, with the sound?
I think it would just be your own whatever device you're using. Can you just double check that you don't have the volume in your microphone or anything? It might be your own settings that's been disabled, because I can certainly hear it. So
I'm trying to swipe my phone to get my sound to work. Mel came out and gave.
Maria, do you want to just pop a note in the chat, because I've got a feeling that she's just not hearing anything, so I don't know that it's...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So as I said, we were tasked with devising the Scottish working definition to provide educational staff, partners, families and learners with a national agreed description of the range of indicators and associated difficulties. Because when you Google it, it's a minefield. There are so many different definitions out there and there's been no agreed. So it was really good that the Scottish Government recognised that this was an area of concern and put together the task for the working party. And in April 2022, this was launched. And this is it, our working definition. So dyscalculia is a neurodevelopmental learning difference which can co-occur with a range of other specific learning needs. It can be described as a specific difficulty in understanding number and number processes, which persists despite the provision of appropriate learning opportunities, including supports and interventions, etc. It is distinguishable from other challenges associated with numeracy and mathematics, this being that it's not just that somebody is having difficulty with maths, it's very, very distinguishable because they have the persistent inability to understand and retrieve numerical facts, the use of underdeveloped procedures and processes, and the severity of difficulties with number sense. And it is really, really important to bear in mind that at all stages, dyscalculia is in the continuum, as I said earlier on, varying from mild to severe, with a range of strengths and difficulties which affect the nature of the activity undertaking and the learning environment and any coping strategies and supports in place. And as a result, as I stated earlier on, every individual will differ in how it affects them and the severity which they experience. However, there are a common set of indicators that we can use when we're working within that working definition. And we have this here on a visual representation, which we'll find extremely helpful. And what we'll do is we can pop into the chat. I'll just quickly copy it. And we pop into the chat, and this is where you can find the working definition. Oh, that's not the right one. That's a video that we're going to be showing later on. Let's see if this one works. There it is.
Popped it in there, Louise.
Oh, we've got it. Perfect. So here we have a working definition as such, and it shows you a range of different indicators ranging from short-term memory, from subitizing, which we're going to talk about later, ordering sequencing, how numbers and amounts represent to each other in their representations. Again, we're going to speak about this later on. And as I said earlier on, applying number skills and to solve problems. So you can see there's a range of difficulties there, which I'm not going to get into in more detail. You can have a look at this in your own time. However, what we do have to remember is that these difficulties do not reflect the individual's cognitive abilities, and that takes me back to that statement earlier on from the 1919 where it was first identified and where it was about the cognitive abilities of a young person are atypical, and that the numeracy and mathematic difficulties are obviously the kind of areas of concern. They may not be typical of performance in other areas and cannot be attributed to other factors. For example, gaps in learning. As we all know, with numeracy and mathematics, it's very, very much that building blocks that we build on top of. And if a young person has had maybe a large period of absence and missed a lot of learning, that could be where the difficulties are arising from. Developmental difficulties, other genetic and neurodevelopmental difficulties, including autism, dyslexia as such, which is why it's so important that we tease all this out. And as we know, the impact can be a barrier, and it can be according to the learning and teaching environment as well. So the kind of final part, though, of the working definition is that it exists in all cultures, across all abilities and socioeconomic backgrounds. As I said already, they can continue to make progress, but they may do so just at a different pace. It is likely to be genetic and unidentified as I'm sure we're all aware, it could result in maths anxiety, low self-esteem, high stress, atypical behaviour and low achievement, which can have associated impacts and opportunities in adult life. So what we're going to do is, that was an awful lot of listening there, and what we're going to do is just give you a very short comfort break, and during that time there's a video we're going to play, and we've also got the YouTube link so that you can look at it. So if you want to make a quick cup of coffee or go and just stretch your legs for a few minutes, and Iona will pop this video on as well, and it's from Daniel Ansari, who's one of the researchers which I mentioned earlier on, and it's really just reiterating the information that I just gave you about what dyscalculia means. So I hope that you find it helpful.
Louise, I think we're just going to, because there's just a few technical difficulties, I think what we're going to just suggest folk do is, because we're sharing in PowerPoint Live, you can actually just click on the link on the screen. I'm still having to admit a few people, and there's a few emails that I need to answer as well, because from folk that are struggling to get in. If folk just want to click the YouTube link and just watch it themselves, they can do that, and we'll do that with the other video as well. I think I'll just make it more straightforward. And this video is how many minutes long? I think it's 3 or...
Oh, it's about 3 and a bit minutes. It's not too long.
So we'll come back in maybe just about 22. So give folk about 6 minutes. That's enough time to go and grab a quick cuppa, watch the video, and we'll see folk back at 4:40.
Okay, and I'll just pop my mic off so that.
Thanks, folks.
So I hope you were able to get a bit of a screen break there, and maybe had time to get a drink of your choice as well. And we're just about to start the sort of second half of tonight's presentation. But before I do, there's people asking about the recording. So it's maybe just that you've come in a wee bit later, but we're going to share that information at the end. But I'll tell you just now that we will be uploading a recording of the video and the presentation to a Padlet, and the Padlet, you will have access to that via a team that we're going to share with you towards the end. So hopefully that helps. And can I just remind everyone to have their microphones on mute, if that's okay? Thank you. So we're just going to start looking at things in a bit more detail now. That's great, thank you. So successful learning in numeracy and maths requires us to attend to the 3 elements that you'll see on the slide just now. So when we're planning teaching and learning, we must develop learners' procedural fluency whilst also developing conceptual understanding. And that can be through the use of manipulatives and visuals and mathematical symbols, but also by providing opportunities for learners to think mathematically. And one way that we can do this is by some of the questions that we plan and deliver. So how did you solve it? Can you justify your thinking? Can you show me that in another way? As examples of some of the ways that we might want to develop that. Procedural fluency is the ability to apply procedures accurately, efficiently and flexible. To transfer procedures to different problems in different contexts, but also to recognise when one strategy or approach is perhaps more appropriate to than another, depending on the calculation that we're trying to solve. It's more than memorising facts or procedures, and it's more than understanding and being able to use just one procedure. It's about that flexibility that I mentioned. It builds in a foundation of conceptual understanding, strategic reasoning and problem solving, and a lot of this we'll unpick in the next session and in the third session too. So we're briefly going to look at 2 areas tonight. So if you think back to that graphic that Louise shared with you earlier on, the graphic that goes alongside the new definition, we're just going to focus on 1 or 2 of them tonight. So learners with dyscalculia encounter difficulty in developing number sense. And we know that research has shown that the dyscalculic learner has particular difficulties with subitizing and with developing number sense. And that's not to say that they can't develop number sense. As Louise mentioned earlier on, it's just that more time is required with dyscalculic learners to develop these concepts conceptually. And if you just move on to the next slide. So this is a quote. There are many quotes that will tell you a wee bit about what number sense is, and this is just one that we particularly like. But on the next slide, we'll talk a wee bit about why number sense is so important. Thank you. So number sense is an important concept. It begins to develop in early mathematics, And it's so important that a lot of the other mathematical skills that we would learn as we progress through the levels build on that early number sense. To make a comparison, number sense is as basic to learning mathematics as phonemic awareness is to learning how to read. So if we think about that comparison, I suppose it stresses the importance. Number sense is the ability to develop relationships with numbers, to develop a sense of the quantity and the size of a number or value in relation to another, but to use this sense to make valid comparisons. It's also the ability to understand and use mathematical language and symbols to explain these comparisons and then use this sense to carry out calculations. Developing number sense leads to fluency and accuracy when using numbers. And learners who have number sense that's well developed know what numbers represent, and they know that numbers can be used flexibly and practically in their everyday lives. Well-developed number sense helps learners understand both how our number system works and how numbers relate to one another. And if it's been developed effectively, they have a range of mathematical strategies at their disposal. So a bit like a toolbox when they're able to use the correct tool depending on the calculation they're being asked. And they know how to use them, but they also know how to adapt them to meet those different approaches. However, if we have learners with poor number sense, they may be unable to subitize even if it's with a small number. They may be unable to estimate whether a numerical answer is reasonable. They may find it difficult or sometimes impossible to count backwards, and they may have trouble with sequencing. So these are some of the things that we should be looking out for. Again, if you just move on to the next slide. When the next few slides are just going to pinpoint our experiences and outcomes, and you'll see that we've put a few of the words in bold there. And really that's so that we think when we're considering experiences and outcomes, some of the language that's deliberately used forces us to consider the approaches and the strategies that we implement to ensure a sound development and understanding of number sense. So we should be exploring numbers, using practical materials, we should be sharing what we know, and we should be trying to share that in different ways. And again, it's just a reflective question for us to think about. Are we confident that the learners that we support are being exposed to those variety of approaches, and that they're using concrete materials and visual representations, are being encouraged, and are we supporting that for all our learners? And again, we'll unpick some of these in the next session too. The next slide just really gets us to think again a wee bit more deeply about those opportunities that we provide, and are they allowing learners to explore, to investigate? Are we providing rich, open-ended activities and effective questioning so that we can support the development of the experiences and outcomes? And are we planning and providing plentiful opportunities for learners to share what's in their heads? Because that gives them an opportunity then to explain what they're thinking. And on this slide, we can see there's a reference here to a range or a variety of methods. And again, it's worthwhile us pausing and thinking about what methods we're currently implementing and which are more or less successful and why that might be. And this is exemplified on this next slide. So what you'll see here is these are some of the approaches that learners might take when they're asked to solve the calculation. In this case, it's they have 5 sweets and they get 7 sweets more. And you'll see as the animations come through that there are some less effective ways of answering that, particularly if we think about when our learners are moving into sort of first and second level. So the first example there shows that the learner is counting from 1. And as we move through the different images, you'll start to see the development of that and the exemplification of number sense when they're starting to use perhaps more efficient strategies. And those efficient strategies will come in really handy when we're working with calculations where the numbers are perhaps not 7 and 5. So we're trying to move learners on from those less effective strategies to strategies that will deepen and develop their number sense. And I'll just pause to those final examples just come through. So we can see in the last few examples that there's a bit more flexibility with the numbers, where they're looking at number sense when they're thinking about the relationships with the numbers that they have. So they're looking at the 7 as a 5 and a 2. Okay, if we just move on. Thanks, Iona. So we looked at some research, and there was 2 British researchers that gave some students some number problems, and those included addition or subtracting 2 numbers. And the researchers found an important difference between the low and the high achieving students. The high achieving students used what we would refer to and call number sense to solve the problem. So they were able to interact with the numbers much more flexibly. So using the example that's on the slide just now, the high achieving students were able to change that calculation to 20 take away 5. However, the low achieving students counted backwards from 21. It's difficult to do that, and there's lots of margin for error in that. So the conclusion through the research was that not that the low achieving students knew less maths, but rather they were interacting with the numbers and maths as a whole very differently. Instead of approaching the problem with flexibility and showing some number sense, they seemed to cling to formal procedures which they had learned, and they held on to them very precisely. And we know that that can, that working memory doesn't always allow us to hold on to that amount of information. So on this slide, here are some ways that we would see learners interacting with that calculation. We know that some learners may always need to rely on concrete materials. They might never move away from that stage. Others, as mentioned before, may display less effective strategies, so they might continue to count on or back in ones, and that can become problematic depending on the numbers. As I said earlier, there's a high degree of error, as that working memory can result in the count being lost and having to go back and revisit the calculation again. Using visual approaches, and we can see here number lines or band models, can really support that visualisation and deepen that understanding. And if we can do that alongside using concrete resources, which encourage perhaps the learners to work in groups of 5 or 10, that can lead to more effective thinking. What we're trying to achieve is more effective and sophisticated approaches, so that learners are able to manipulate numbers into friendlier numbers, so into groups of 5 or 10 perhaps, and then establish links between those number facts. I'm going to pass on back to Louise temporarily just to go over the next few slides. So Louise, it's over to you.
So we've got a short video, but we maybe just leave the video for just now, just thinking about time, and we can pop the link into the chat for you. You can have a little look at it. It's by Joe Bowler, and it looks at number sense and talks it through, just similar to what Maria has just done. So if you can skip that slide just now, and we'll pop that in, you can look at it in your own time. So I'm going to.
Sorry, Louise, I popped the link in the chat, so that's there for folk now. So
and it's on the Padlet. It's on the Padlet as well, so you can look at that. And there's also another couple of videos that we popped on as well that you may find helpful. So I'm going to just kind of look on again about some other difficulties with number sense. And as I said, I'm going to defer back to Kosk. And he was talking about with Dyscalculia that it was about the processing numerical magnitude of information and symbolic information. And this being it's associating and comparing symbolic, that being our numbers, our numerals, our digits, and non-symbolic. And that's like dot patterns, random stick patterns, etc. And Maria's going to get into detail about that and a wee bit more later on. So the difficulties arise, though, when our learners have to attend to the comparison of quantity. So, for example, they need to understand the 7ness of 7. What does it actually mean, the 9ness of 9? And then also what the written symbols represent in terms of quantity and size, etc. So I'm going to talk through just a couple of assessments that you could perhaps use and examples which will hopefully explain this in a little bit more detail. So this one here is where we have 2 numerals. We have a number 3 and a number 8, and where we're saying to the young person, which one of these is taller? So this question here is looking at the concrete size, the physical size of the object, and not the abstract quantity. And therefore, learners who have got dyscalculia can answer this just as quick as their peers. And it's all about this ability to respond, this quickness, this ability to respond within not as much a set time, but how much processing it actually takes. And Maria had said earlier on, with our young people with the number sense difficulties, they're perhaps using less sophisticated strategies and counting by one. So again, when we're looking for our learners who have dyscalculia, it's about these specific areas of difficulty, and it's again to do with one of the examples is that processing. So if we have a little look at the next example, this one's a little bit different because as you can see here, the number 7 is in physical size larger. than the number 9. But what we're actually asking here is which number is greater? So with here, our learners with dyscalculia may get the correct answer. However, what they did was they took an extra millisecond. And we do have some research about this that I'm happy to share with anybody, and you can look into it in a bit more detail. Because what they firstly had to do was they had to look at the font size, and then they had to process the size of the font, and it didn't reflect the quantity. Thus, they took that extra millisecond. So they're saying to them, hang on a minute here, that number 7 is larger. But no, that's not what they're asking me to do. They're asking me which number is bigger or larger or greater, and that's the number 9. So I often actually compare this when I've been thinking about it and talking it through with learners that I've been working with. I compare this to another test, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, and it's this one here. I compare it to this one where you're being asked to say the colour and not the word. And you know how that way you've actually got to look at it really, really carefully, and it just gives you that extra millisecond that you've got to actually think about it. And that's what our young people say when they're asked to do that previous example, that they can get the answer, but it takes them that extra millisecond in order to get it. And when you're actually assessing a young person, you actually see that. And what I've done is I've put an article onto the Padlet which goes into more detail about this if you're interested in that. So then I'm going to move on to another example of number sense, and this time being that estimation and the ability to work out if an answer could possibly be correct due to that knowledge of quantity. So this was when I was doing some case studies in the time when we were putting together our policy, and I gave 2 primary 7 learners this exact same calculation. 37 add 45, and they got the answer of 19. It wasn't the actual answer as such that I was more interested in. It was actually about their responses. So if you're kind of wondering what they did, both young people did the exact same thing. They did have a difficulty with place value. They both said 7 add 5 is 12, 3 add 4 is 7, and added them together. So we can see straight away that there's a real difficulty there that we can work on. Exactly. However, it was the responses that I was given, because one of the young people said to me straight away, that can't be the right answer. And when I questioned further, they said, because the number 19 is less than both of those numbers, there's no way that can be the correct answer. And when I went on and did several other examples, we actually worked out they were doing exactly the same thing. And each time we're getting frustrated because they could see that there was no way the answers could be correct. However, the young person who ended up, when we went through the full process and did some other activities, etc., looked at the indicators, they did not even blink. They said, nope, adamant that answer 19 was the right answer. They didn't see that there was not a possibility that answer could be correct because the quantity was less than either of the 2 numbers that were actually being asked to add. So that's a really good example, as I say, hopefully that it can highlight that difficulty with estimation and quantity, etc. So I'm going to hand you over now to Maria again, and she's going to talk me through more about subitizing.
Thanks, Louise. So I say subitizing, some people say subitizing. I don't think it really matters. I don't know if there's a right or wrong. But what you'll see here is a bit of a definition or several statements that talk to us a wee bit about what subitizing is. And I'll pause just for a minute to let you read through that. And what to keep in mind is that dyscalculic learners don't have this ability. So we're saying there that it is innate, but actually if a learner has a diagnosis of dyscalculia, this is really, really difficult for those learners. So we're going to talk in the next few slides really about what subitizing is and ways that you might want to use to try and develop that. So before we start, there are 2 types of subitizing. We see here there's perceptual subitizing, and that relates to the number of objects being directly perceived as a single unit, so in this case 3. However, children can often identify the number of objects in a larger collection by building on from that ability. They may identify, for example, the number of objects by partitioning larger collections into smaller groups that are within our kind of subitizing range. So the example there on the right-hand side, children may recognise that there are 7 objects in a collection. But mentally, what they're doing is they're partitioning their collection into a group of 3 and a group of 4, and we refer to that as conceptual subitizing. And that ability to break numbers apart, to partition them in different ways, is a critical feature of developing number sense that I spoke about earlier on. So what we would promote is regular daily practice of subitizing to support the development of conceptual understanding. And we'll show you in the next couple of slides one way or a few different ways that we can do that. So there is a progression to subitizing, and it's important that we are aware of what the progression is. So the first thing that you would do is you would show regular dot patterns, and it doesn't always need to be dot patterns. We'll show different visuals in a second, but you're showing those dot patterns in order. And when you're showing the dot pattern, the two questions that flashed up there are really, really important. So what do you see and how do you see them? Really important that we continue asking that question. So we're going to show the regular dot patterns and we talk about them and we ask those questions. We move on then to flashing the regular patterns so that the learners have less time and we can really see and assess there what the learners know. But we're still doing that in order, so we're doing 1 through to 6. When we think the learners have got that well established and they've demonstrated an understanding in that, we're going to start looking at those regular dot patterns, but we're flashing them this time in a random order. But the whole time that we're doing it, we're asking the learners, what do you see and how do you see them? And when the learners are ready, and you'll know the learners you work with, and you'll know when they are ready for this, but if they suggest to you that they, for example, if you're showing a dot pattern of 6, some of them might say, I see that as a 3 and a 3. Other learners might say, no, I see it as a 2 and a 2. Some learners might see it as a collection of 1s. And it's important that we take all those responses and talk through them. You might want to even record them, and the learners can then revisit those, all the different ways that we can make up, in this case, 6. And when we've done all of that, we're going to go through that same process again, but this time we're going to look at irregular dot patterns, and we're still going to ask those two important questions. What do you see and how do you see them? So again, we still show them and we just get the learners to tell us what they see. We start to flash them just exactly the way we did before. And then the final part of this progression is that when we're flashing the irregular dots, we're doing it in a random order. So we start off exactly as we did with the process before. We're going to do the irregular patterns in order. We're going to flash them, and then we're going to flash them in a random order. And that's the process that we need to go through with our learners, asking those questions to make sure that they have got this skill really fully developed. It's so important. On the next slide, there's just an idea, and I've used these approaches before for learners who have demonstrated difficulties with numbers, and really useful for the learners that we're discussing tonight. So our dyscalculic learners is they might want to look at a dot pattern, for example, a dot pattern of 5, and actually make the pattern with their finger in the air, or follow the pattern and clap the pattern 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So just to really get the learners immersed in these patterns so that they become well established in their thinking. Overlearning is really important, and I mentioned earlier on it doesn't always need to be the dot patterns that I showed earlier on, but that range of visuals and that regular practice can really support the understanding. So there's a few examples there that you might want to use. You can also use flashcards. What we're saying here, and the important element of this slide, is using a range of visuals can really support that assessment of what do they know or what do they not know yet. And it really gives us that forensic and that formative assessment of where we need to go with learners. We're just going to look in the next few slides at things to look out for. So this is the possible indicators at early level. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about in the first bullet point there is about the counting principles. So the counting principles are the skills which move our learners on from simply rote counting or mimicking in some cases to rational counting. It's important that learners have experiences which help develop each of the principles, and you'll see them listed there in that bullet point. It might be worth considering exploring each of these in much more depth. What I've found in my experience is that we concentrate on 1 or 2 of them to the detriment of the other ones, and it's important that learners experience ample opportunities to develop each principle in full. Other issues to consider here are sequencing, sorting, and making links between the numeral name, and the associated quantity. And making reference to this in everyday contexts is really important. We will be planning a national series looking at counting, looking at the progression, the development and the understanding. And again, if that's something you're interested in, if you come back to, we'll share our email address at the end. It'll be launched in January, so we can give you a bit more detail about what that contains. The next slide will look at some possible indicators at sort of first and second level. And what we're seeing here and what we're thinking about here is, are our learners able to make that connection between, for example, 7, the word 7, the number name, and the quantity? Are they able to make connections between some of the maths facts? Have they got place value established? What about the symbols that we use? And are they using them effectively and correctly? The next bullet point talks about visual spatial. If you just move on, there we go. So when we're talking and thinking about visual spatial, we're thinking here about the mental manipulation of things like graph images. This is really difficult for the learners who have dyscalculia. Things like symmetry and geometry can be a real challenge for these learners. They may confuse left and right. They may have a tendency not to see patterns, and that may manifest itself in an inability to copy a shape or reversing numbers. Poor visual spatial working memory may inhibit a learner's ability mentally to capture an image and may restrict or prevent them from visualising tools such as using timelines. So these are all things worth considering. We mentioned this a wee bit earlier on, but if it's undetected, learners with dyscalculia can start to develop anxiety in relation to maths tasks across the curriculum. Engagement levels might be low, and there may be difficulty with looking at alternative methods to solving problems. What we spoke about just in the last few slides is what we might see presented in a sort of classroom environment, in a learning environment. But we know that having dyscalculia can affect learners' ability to understand and achieve out with those day-to-day routines and how they manage out with school, just in their everyday interactions. And in the next slide, we're going to list 1 or 2 of those. So things like being able to apply maths to every day when they're handling money can be really difficult. It could be that the learners are having trouble measuring things, so that could be ingredients or liquid in a bottle or any form of measurement. They may struggle with directions if there is that right-left confusion. They'll struggle to read a map. They'll find estimating across the board quite difficult, but maybe estimating distances and speed really quite difficult. And as I mentioned earlier on, they'll have trouble understanding information displayed in a graph form. I've mentioned a bit about this earlier, but there'll be some trouble potentially with sequencing or counting backwards and doing that reliably. Estimating, really, really difficult. Subitizing. And also with an analogue clock face, a person with dyscalculia may see, for example, that it's 10:35, but they will struggle to work out how long it is until 11 o'clock. So that idea of being able to conceptualise the passage of time is really difficult. So these are all the sort of things to look out for. We've shared a lot of information tonight. We hope we've given you things to consider and reflect on. And as I said earlier on, the next 2 sessions will start to unpick a lot of these, and we'll go into things in much more detail. On this slide, what you'll see are some reflections that you might want to revisit. You might want to perhaps record some of them in that reflection log that will make sure you've got access to. You might want to take some of these points back to your own establishment. You might want to share and discuss them with your peers or with people across your own establishments, and you might want to just have a think about them in your own context. We'll come back to some of the questions. I'm just seeing some of the questions in the chat there, so we'll come back to those. We're just in the last couple of slides just now. So this is the date of the next session, and I know a few people have been asking how we'll join the next session. So the link on the bottom of the slide there will give you a link to join the team. When you join the team, you will have access to a lot of the resources that Louise spoke about, the reflective log, for example, and you'll have access to the video clips that we spoke about, the Padlet that I'm about to share with you. The Padlet will have the recording of tonight's session and also the PDF of tonight's session, and then it will be the 31st of January when we'll revisit some of the teaching approaches and the assessment. We're going to leave you with a wee bit of homework. If you could take some of the learning from tonight's session, particularly in relation to number sense and subitizing, and think about taking that back to the reflection log or the journal, to indicate how you would know if a learner had well developed number sense and developed subitizing skills. And if you want to have a think about that between now and the 31st of January, which is the next session, we can maybe start the next session off with a bit of reflection based on tonight's session and about what you've found through your engagements and interactions with your learners. And we're going to share the Padlet with you. Next slide. So just before we share the Padlet with you, we need to get these sessions, because these are national professional learning events, we need to have evaluations, and we've put on the slide there a QR code which will take you directly to the forum. But you also can, if we pop it in the chat, if you can just please, or you can click on it actually, if you don't mind taking a wee bit of time to fill in the evaluation, that will really help us. We do look at these evaluations, we gather some stats, and we work out how we can then best take that feedback into the next session. So you will get access to that, but you can take time between this session and the next one to fill that in. That would be great. And the last couple of slides are just going to highlight for you some reading material, some further reading that you might be interested in. But what we will do, as we've said earlier on, is gather all of this and put it in one place for you. And that will be on the Padlet. So if you just move on to the slide, Iona, that has the Padlet.
Oh, yep, sorry.
That's okay.
I'll just share that. That's one more that I
So, no,
yep.
that's okay.
I'll just pop the link to the slide, the link to the Padlet in the chat.
Great.
There's quite a few questions that we will try and go back to. We've still got another 15 or so minutes, so we'll go back through the chat and try and, between the three of us, answer as many questions as we can. But one thing that we are hoping to do alongside the materials for this series, the recordings of this series, the professional learning and so on, is we're actually looking to put together a frequently asked questions resource on the National Improvement Hub as well. And so what we'll do is we'll take these questions and we'll probably try and improve on maybe some sort of off the top of our head answers that we could give today. And we'll put answers to these questions together and publish it as a frequently asked questions alongside all the other resources for this webinar series. For those of you who joined late, the recording will be available to you on the Padlet. So maybe you could go away and watch the video and then do your evaluation afterwards. That would be really good. And apologies to people who've had technical issues as well. Unfortunately, just with technology and up nearly 500 people on the call, that's probably going to happen. So yes, so the slides will be available on the Padlet. The recordings will be available on the Padlet. We won't send out the PowerPoint as an attachment on an email simply because it's too big and it will cause everybody's inboxes, well, particularly probably my outbox, to crash. So we'll pop it on the Padlet. So the key link that you need, and you maybe just want to save that into your favourites just now, or take a copy of it and, I don't know, email it to yourself or something so you've got it. That link to the Padlet is the one that will be really important, and we'll probably email that out and you'll get all the resources on that. So hopefully that's answered some of the technical questions at the end.